Hey guys, tonight the invitation to excess. The year was 1750, a time when London did not merely sleep, but rather it exhaled a thick, sulphurous breath of coal smoke, ambition and secret desires. For Julian Thorne, a young land surveyor from the rugged, honest wilderness of the Virginia colony, the city was a suffocating labyrinth of soot-stained brick and towering egos. He stood at the window of his cramped lodgings in Cheapside, watching the mud-splattered carriages rattle over the uneven cobblestones below. The air in the room was stale, smelling of old parchment and the cheap tallow candles he burned while studying his family's disputed legal deeds. In his calloused hand, he gripped a heavy, cream-colored card, an invitation that felt less like a social gesture and more like a summons to an alternate reality. The ink was elegant, the calligraphy swirling like the dark currents of the Thames itself, a night of illumination and unparalleled delight at Vauxhall Gardens. To a man raised among the silent, towering pines and the grueling, rhythmic toil of the New World, this invitation represented the very thing his father had warned him against: British decadence. His father, a man of stern faith and hard earth, had often spoken of London as a golden cage, a place where men traded their souls for a glimpse of artificial light. Yet Julian could not deny the magnetic pull of the card. He had spent 3 months in London trying to settle a family estate through proper channels, but he had found only red tape, cold shoulders, and the sneers of lawyers. Perhaps, he reasoned with a heavy heart, the secrets he sought were not hidden in dusty, ink-stained legal ledgers, but in the flickering shadows of the world's most famous pleasure garden. The ritual of preparation. Julian turned away from the window and faced the small, cracked looking-glass on the wall. To enter Vauxhall was to enter a theatre. One could not simply walk in as a provincial traveller from the colonies. He began his preparation with a deliberate, almost ritualistic slowness. He donned a coat of deep bottle green velvet, a colour that reminded him of the Virginia woods after a summer rain, and a waistcoat of cream silk embroidered with subtle, golden vines. He chose to eschew the heavy, suffocating, powdered wigs favoured by the London elite. Instead, he pulled his own dark, chestnut hair back into a neat, tight queue, fastening it with a simple strip of black leather. As he adjusted his lace cravat, his fingers trembling slightly, he felt like an imposter. "You are a man of the soil, Julian," he whispered to his own reflection. "Do not let the gold leaf and the candlelight blind you to the truth." He checked his pocket watch, a sturdy silver piece that had survived the Atlantic crossing. It was nearly 7 o'clock. The transformation was complete. He was no longer a surveyor from the frontier. He was a gentleman of mystery, ready to step into the belly of the beast. The descent to the river. By the time Julian stepped out into the street, the sun was a bruised purple, sinking slowly behind the jagged, magnificent skyline of St. Paul's Cathedral. The London air had cooled, carrying the sharp scent of river salt, roasting chestnuts, and the ever-present tang of coal dust. He hailed a sedan chair, the porters grunting with the familiar strain as they lifted him, and began the journey through the narrowing, crowded streets toward the riverbank. London was waking up in a different way now. This was the London of the night, a city of silk masks, expensive gin, and whispered scandals behind closed fans. At the garden stairs, the chaos was absolute and deafening. Dozens of wherries, small, nimble rowboats, jostled for position on the dark, churning waters of the Thames. The boatmen shouted colorful curses that would make a seasoned sailor blush, their oars splashing rhythmically in the murky water. "To the South Bank, Governor," a boatman asked, his face a weathered map of scars, soot, and greed. "To Vauxhall," Julian replied, his voice sounding steadier than he felt. He stepped into the boat, the ancient wood creaking under his weight, and sat on the damp bench. As they pushed off from the stone wharf, the city began to recede into a silhouette. The towering, soot-stained buildings of Westminster became ghosts against the darkening sky. The Thames was a black, undulating ribbon, reflecting the flickering lanterns of hundreds of passing boats like fallen stars caught in the current. Julian looked back at the city, a place of rigid laws, gallows, and hanging judges, and then forward toward the South Bank, where the rules of society seemed to dissolve in the rising mist. The vision of the Grove. As they drew closer to the shore, a faint, ethereal sound drifted across the water. It was not the roar of the city, but the delicate, soaring notes of a violin accompanied by the low, continuous rumble of 1,000 voices. And then he saw it. Vauxhall Gardens did not merely appear, it erupted from the darkness like a fever dream. Thousands of hand-blown glass lamps, red, blue, amber, and emerald, hung from the ancient elm trees like glowing, forbidden fruit. The lights spilled over the high stone walls, turning the riverbank into a shimmering, iridescent dreamscape that defied the natural order of the night. Julian stepped onto the landing, his leather boots clicking sharply on the stone. The air here was intoxicatingly different. It smelled of blooming jasmine, expensive French perfume, and the faint, metallic tang of gunpowder from distant, testing fireworks. He handed his ticket to the gateman, a towering figure in gold-trimmed livery, who inspected Julian's American-made coat with a mixture of professional curiosity and silent disdain. "Welcome to the Grove, sir," the man muttered, stepping aside to reveal the entrance. Julian walked through the grand gates, and for a long moment he simply forgot to breathe. Before him stretched the Grand Walk, 300 yards of perfectly leveled, white gravel, flanked by soaring, majestic elms that formed a natural cathedral ceiling. The trees were draped in Vauxhall lamps, their flickering light dancing on the jewels of the passing ladies and the silver hilts of the gentlemen's swords. It was a sea of absolute excess. There were duchesses in towering wigs rubbing shoulders with wealthy, boisterous merchants, poets arguing with charming drunkards, and beautiful women hidden behind delicate lace masks, their laughter ringing out like silver bells across the garden. This was a place where the social order of England was both celebrated and mocked in the same breath. The observer in the shadows. Julian moved to the side of the walk, pressing his back against a wooden trellis covered in climbing white roses. He felt the heavy weight of his American identity, the plainness of his speech, the directness of his gaze, and the lack of artifice in his manner. In this garden, he realized, everything was a metaphor, every smile was a gambit, and every shadow held a price. "You look as though you've just stepped off a ship from the moon, sir," a voice said softly near his elbow. Julian turned sharply. Standing beside him was a man of middle age, dressed in an outrageous suit of lavender silk with silver buttons, holding a silver-topped cane that glowed in the lamplight. His eyes were sharp, dark, and missed nothing. "Not the moon," Julian replied, bowing slightly as protocol dictated. "Virginia." The man chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that suggested he had seen too much of the world. "Ah, the colonies, the land of tobacco, vast horizons, and quiet rebellion. I am Mr. Sterling, a humble observer of this beautiful, glittering madness. And you, Mr. Virginia, are currently standing in the most dangerous place in all of England." Julian frowned, his hand instinctively resting near his empty sword belt. "I see no soldiers here, Mr. Sterling, only music, expensive wine, and lights." Mr. Sterling leaned in closer, the sharp scent of expensive snuff and aged brandy surrounding him like a cloud. "The soldiers are easy to spot, my boy. It is the hidden desires that kill you here. Look closely. That lady in the blue silk, she is bankrupting her husband at the gaming tables in the pavilion tonight. That gentleman in the velvet mask, he is a spy for the Jacobites, trading secrets for gold. And you are looking for something that isn't on the evening's menu." "And what is that?" Julian asked, his curiosity piqued. "The truth," Sterling whispered, tapping his cane twice on the gravel. "A very rare and very expensive commodity in a pleasure garden designed for lies. The midnight current." Before Julian could respond, a sudden, piercing fanfare of trumpets erupted from the great rotunda. The crowd surged forward as one, a tidal wave of silk, lace, and perfume. The main event of the evening was beginning, and the American traveler found himself swept up in the human current, being pulled deeper into the glowing heart of the midnight masquerade. The lights seemed to grow brighter, the music of Handel soared higher into the night sky, and for the first time, Julian Thorne felt the cold, thrilling realization that he might never be the same man again. The invitation to excess had been accepted, the threshold had been crossed, and the night was only just beginning to reveal its teeth. Crossing the Thames. The departure from the solid ground of Westminster was not merely a physical journey, it was a slow, deliberate descent into an aquatic purgatory. Julian Thorne stepped onto the narrow, rocking bench of the wherry, feeling the damp chill of the river seep through his leather boots. The Thames at night was not the river of the daytime merchants. It was a black, churning throat, swallowing the city's secrets and reflecting nothing but the dim, flickering ghosts of oil lamps. As the boatman pushed off with a heavy, rhythmic grunt, the sounds of the London streets began to fade, replaced by the haunting, rhythmic slap of oars against the oily water. The mist, a thick grey shroud known as the London ivy, began to roll in from the marshes, curling around the boat like ghostly fingers. The liminal space. "Keep your weight center, Master Virginia," the boatman growled, his voice a gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in the fog. "The Thames is a hungry mistress tonight. She's already claimed a merchant's trunk and a drunkard's hat since the tide turned." Julian gripped the damp gunwale, his knuckles white. To his left and right, other boats emerged from the mist like apparitions. These were the vessels of the wealthy, grander wherries adorned with silk canopies and private musicians playing soft, mournful flutes. In those boats sat the elite of England, draped in furs and velvet, their faces obscured by the shadows of their tricorn hats. They laughed, a brittle, hollow sound that carried unnaturally far across the water. To them, this crossing was a triviality. To Julian, it felt like crossing the river Styx. The fog grew thicker, swallowing the silhouette of the Houses of Parliament. For a moment, Julian felt a profound sense of isolation. He was suspended between two worlds, the rigid, cold reality of the London he had come to hate, and the shimmering, artificial paradise of the South Bank that he had yet to understand. The lanterns in the mist. Then the first hint of the transformation appeared. It began as a faint, amber smudge in the grey distance, a solitary light struggling against the fog. Then another appeared, and another, until a line of glowing lanterns began to trace the curve of the southern shore. These were not the harsh, utilitarian street lamps of Cheapside. These were the Vauxhall stars. "There she glows," the boatman muttered, his pace slowing as he navigated the crowded water. "The only place in England where a beggar can look at a queen, provided he has the shilling for the gate." As they drew closer, the mist began to thin, burned away by the sheer intensity of the illumination. The gardens were revealed in increments. First, the massive, dark silhouettes of the ancient elms, then the shimmering reflection of thousands of glass lamps dancing on the surface of the river like a carpet of liquid jewels. The water itself seemed to change color, turning from a muddy black to a vibrant, glowing emerald as it caught the light from the garden's edge. The symphony of the shore. The silence of the river was suddenly shattered by a wall of sound. It was a cacophony that should have been chaotic, but was instead strangely melodic. The distant roar of the grand orchestra in the rotunda mingled with the shouting of link boys, the barking of stray dogs, and the high-pitched haggling of orange girls at the landing. Julian watched as a grand barge, gilded in gold leaf and carrying a party of masked aristocrats, slid past his humble wherry. A woman in a mask made of silver feathers leaned over the side, her eyes meeting Julian's for a fleeting second. She tossed a wilted rose into the water, a silent gesture of discarded beauty that vanished into the wake of the boats. "Steady now," the boatman called out as they neared the stone stairs of the Vauxhall landing. The jostling of boats became intense. Wherries bumped against each other with hollow thuds, oars tangled like the legs of giant water insects. The air became thick with the scent of the garden, a heady, suffocating mixture of coal smoke, expensive hair powder, roasted meats, and the damp, earthy smell of the riverbanks. Touching the promised land. The boat bumped against the slippery stone of the stairs. A link boy, no older than 10 and covered in the soot of his own torch, reached out a grimy hand to steady the boat. Julian handed the boatman his coin, a silver shilling that felt like a heavy sacrifice, and stepped out onto the south bank. As his feet hit the stone, the vibration of the music seemed to travel up through his bones. Behind him lay the Thames, a dark barrier he had crossed. Before him lay the gilded gates of the pleasure garden, glowing with an almost radioactive intensity. Julian paused at the top of the stairs, adjusting his green velvet coat. The mist still clung to his shoulders like a damp cape, a reminder of the dark river he had just survived. He looked back one last time at the distant, dark silhouette of the city on the opposite shore. Over there, he was a nameless surveyor with a disputed inheritance. But here, under the artificial stars of Vauxhall, he could be anyone. He turned toward the gates, the light of 10,000 lamps reflecting in his eyes. The crossing was over. The night, in all its expensive, dangerous glory, had finally begun. The grand entrance. The threshold of Vauxhall was not merely a gate. It was a sensory assault, a shimmering boundary between the mundane misery of London and a manufactured paradise. As Julian Thorne moved away from the damp edge of the Thames, the silence of the river was swallowed whole by a roar of human extravagance. Before him stood the gilded gates, massive, ornate structures of wrought iron and gold leaf that seemed to vibrate with the sheer energy of the crowd pressing against them. Julian felt a momentary surge of vertigo. Back in Virginia, the largest gathering he had ever witnessed was a harvest festival under the harvest moon, but that was a whisper compared to this thunder. Here, the air was a thick, perfumed soup of lavender, musk, and the sharp, metallic tang of 10,000 flickering oil lamps. The Golden Gateway. The entrance was flanked by two massive stone pillars, upon which sat sculpted lions that seemed to sneer at the newcomers. Julian handed his silver ticket to a porter dressed in a livery of scarlet and gold, a man whose posture was as rigid as a bayonet. With a curt nod, the porter stepped aside, and Julian passed through. Immediately, the world changed. The Grand Walk opened up before him, a vast, gravel-strewn boulevard that vanished into a hazy distance of light and shadow. Overhead, the ancient elms did not merely grow, they groaned under the weight of Vauxhall lamps, thousands of small, hand-blown glass globes filled with oil, suspended by invisible wires. They hung like glowing clusters of grapes, casting a warm, amber hue that turned the skin of every passerby into polished marble. The Symphony of Excess. Then the music hit him. It did not come from one direction. It seemed to bleed from the very trees themselves. From the direction of the great rotunda, the notes of a Handel concerto soared, the violins wailing with a frantic, joyful urgency. The brass section provided a deep, rhythmic pulse that Julian felt in the soles of his boots. But it wasn't just the orchestra. It was the human symphony, the rhythmic crunch of thousands of heels on fine gravel, the rustle of stiff silk petticoats that sounded like a coming storm, and the laughter, a high, brittle sound that felt both inviting and exclusionary. Julian stood still for a moment, a green velvet island in a sea of shifting colors. He saw a duke, identifiable by the star on his breast, sharing a joke with a man who looked like a common gambler. He saw women in towering, powdered wigs, some topped with miniature glass ships or baskets of silk fruit, their faces painted with thick, white lead and patches of black velvet shaped like hearts or stars. This was the melange of London, where the social hierarchy was momentarily blurred by the golden haze of the lamps. The overwhelming crowds. The density of the crowd was suffocating. Julian found himself shoulder to shoulder with a group of boisterous young fops, their lace cuffs trailing in the dirt, their speech a coded dialect of French-inspired slang. "Make way for the American," one of them sneered, his eyes glazed with arrack punch, though his tone was more playful than malicious. Julian didn't answer. He simply stepped deeper into the throng, his eyes darting from one pavilion to the next. To his right, he saw the supper boxes, small, semi-private alcoves decorated with paintings by Hogarth and Hayman. In each box, parties of 6 or 8 sat around narrow tables, consuming thin-sliced ham that was rumored to be so transparent you could read a newspaper through it. The occupants of the boxes acted as if they were on a stage, dining for the benefit of the walkers, while the walkers stared back with unabashed curiosity. The scent of mystery. As he moved further from the gates, the light dimmed slightly and the crowd thinned into more purposeful groups. The air grew cooler as the trees became denser. Here, the scent of the garden shifted. The perfume and coal smoke were replaced by the damp, green smell of wet earth and night-blooming jasmine. Julian reached into his waistcoat and felt the small, brass key he had carried all the way from the colonies. It was the only lead he had to his family's lost legacy. He had been told to look for a man with a silver-headed cane near the statues of the Great Walk, but in this sea of gold and light, everyone seemed to carry a cane, and every face was a mask. He realized then that Vauxhall was a labyrinth, not of hedges, but of intentions. The grand entrance had welcomed him, yes, but it had also swallowed him. As he looked up at the flickering lamps, he felt a strange, thrilling terror. In London, he had been Julian Thorne, the surveyor. Here, in the heart of the grand entrance, he was merely a ghost in a velvet coat, waiting for the night to tell him who he was supposed to become. The orchestra reached a crescendo, a final, crashing chord that echoed off the distant pavilions. The crowd gasped in unison as the first firework of the evening hissed into the sky, leaving a trail of white smoke against the black velvet of the London night. The show had begun. Whispers in the Rotunda. The transition from the open, gravel paths of the Grand Walk to the interior of the Great Rotunda was like stepping inside a hollowed-out jewel. As Julian Thorne crossed the threshold, the cool night air was replaced by a heavy, stifling warmth, a cocktail of melting beeswax candles, expensive French hair powder, and the metallic tang of dry champagne. Above him, the ceiling soared in a magnificent dome, gilded and painted with allegorical figures that seemed to look down on the revelers with celestial boredom. The acoustics here were treacherous. Every whisper seemed to travel along the curved walls, turning a private confession into public gossip. Julian felt the weight of 1,000 eyes, yet most of them were hidden. Masks were the true currency of the Rotunda. There were masks of porcelain, masks of silk, and masks of feathered lace, each one a shield for a reputation or a weapon for a scandal. The dance of shadows. Julian stood near a fluted marble pillar, his hand resting instinctively on his waistcoat. The music here was louder, more frantic. A chamber orchestra sat on a raised dais, their bows moving in a blurred frenzy as they performed a piece that sounded like a chase. To his left, a group of aristocrats were engaged in a spirited game of hazard, the rattle of the dice sounding like dry bones hitting the velvet table. He felt a sudden, sharp prickle at the back of his neck. He was being watched. Not with the casual curiosity of a passerby, but with the focused intent of a predator. He turned his head slowly, scanning the sea of lace and wigs, and then he saw her. Or perhaps it was a him, it was impossible to tell. The figure was leaning against a gilded archway, draped in a cloak of midnight blue velvet that swallowed the candlelight. Their face was entirely obscured by a mask of silver silk, molded to the contours of a human skull, yet elegant in its macabre beauty. The invitation to converse. The figure did not move, yet Julian felt an invisible tether pull him forward. He navigated the crowd, dodging a drunken baronet and a trio of giggling debutantes, until he stood only a few paces away from the silver mask. "The air in here is thick with lies, is it not, Mr. Thorne?" The voice was a low, melodic rasp, neither distinctly masculine nor feminine, but possessing a chilling authority. Julian froze. No one in this city, let alone this garden, was supposed to know his name. "Who are you?" Julian asked, his voice sounding hollow against the marble. "And how do you know my name?" The masked figure stepped out from the shadows of the archway. Up close, Julian could see the intricate embroidery on the silver silk, tiny, dark thorns woven into the fabric. "Names are like coins in Vauxhall. They are spent quickly and often end up in the wrong hands," the figure replied, their eyes glittering through the narrow slits of the mask. "As for who I am, think of me as a ghost with a memory. You carry a brass key in your pocket, do you not? A key that fits a lock 3,000 miles away, yet was forged in the fires of a London forge. A treacherous confidence." Julian felt a cold sweat break across his brow. The family secret, the surveyor's map, and the hidden deeds was supposed to be buried. "I am here on legal business," Julian stated, trying to regain his composure. "Nothing more." The figure laughed, a soft, dry sound like the rustling of dead leaves. "Legal business in a pleasure garden? That is like searching for a virgin in a brothel. You are out of your depth, Virginian. The men you seek to meet tonight do not trade in law, they trade in blood and land. They are watching you from the supper boxes, waiting to see if you are a wolf or a sheep." The figure leaned in closer, the scent of sandalwood and old parchment surrounding Julian. "Look toward the third box on the left. The man with the emerald ring. Do not speak to him. If he offers you a drink, pour it into the gravel. If he offers you a hand, keep yours in your pocket." "Why are you telling me this?" Julian hissed. The silver mask tilted slightly. Because London is bored, Mr. Thorne, and I find I have a sudden, inexplicable desire to see the underdog win, at least for one night. The disappearing act. Before Julian could ask another question, a sudden surge of the crowd pushed a group of dancers between them. A woman in a massive, powdered wig bumped into Julian, spilling a drop of dark wine onto his green velvet coat. He apologized instinctively, looking back toward the archway. The midnight blue cloak was gone. The silver mask had vanished into the swirling sea of revelers as if it had never existed. Julian stood alone by the marble pillar, the frantic violins of the orchestra now sounding like a warning. He looked toward the third supper box on the left. There, sitting in the shadows, was a man with a heavy jaw and a glittering emerald ring on his right hand, staring directly at Julian with a smile that did not reach his eyes. The whispers in the rotunda were no longer just background noise. They were a map. But as Julian moved toward the exit, he realized with a sinking heart that he didn't know if the silver mask was a guardian angel or the very devil leading him to the slaughter. The night had just become a game of survival. The Symphony of Shadows. The rotunda was a cage of gold, but the air outside, near the great outdoor orchestra stand, was thick with a different kind of tension. Julian Thorne moved away from the suffocating heat of the indoor dancers, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He sought the open air, but found only a different theater, the theater of sound. Here, in the center of the grove, stood the grand, multi-tiered orchestra stand, a structure of white-painted wood and gilded lyres that rose into the night sky like a temple to a frantic god. The music changed the moment he stepped onto the gravel path. It was no longer the polite, airy minuet of the ballroom. It was something darker, something driving. The violins were being played with a violent, obsessive energy, their strings crying out in a language that Julian, a man of the silent woods, could barely translate, yet understood deep in his marrow. The architect of sound. At the center of the stand, illuminated by a halo of 100 flickering candles, stood the conductor. He was a thin, skeletal man with hands that moved like striking cobras. Each flick of his wrist didn't just direct the musicians, it seemed to direct the very emotions of the crowd. Julian leaned against a dark elm tree, the rough bark grounding him. He noticed then that the music was not merely entertainment. As the tempo shifted, dropping into a low, mournful cello solo, the behavior of the crowd shifted with it. Groups of men moved closer together, their heads bowed in conspiratorial huddles. Lovers drifted toward the darker edges of the paths, their movements synchronized with the rhythmic pulse of the bassoons. It is a coded language, isn't it? Julian spun around. It was the silver-masked figure again, appearing from behind the tree as if they had materialized from the music itself. The music, Julian asked, his breath hitching. Listen closely, Mr. Thorne, the figure whispered, their silver skull mask catching the amber glow of a distant lantern. In London, the censors watch the printing presses, the spies watch the coffee houses, but no one suspects the violins. That melody they are playing now, the one with the triple-meter shift, that is a signal. It tells the initiated that the person they seek is present in the garden. When the trumpets blare out of key in the next movement, it will mean the price of the secret has doubled. The hidden coda. Julian listened, and suddenly the symphony lost its beauty and gained a terrifying clarity. He realized that the entire garden was a clockwork machine and the music was its gears. The Symphony of Shadows was not just a title, it was a functioning tool of espionage. The orchestra began a new movement, a dark, brooding piece that felt like a funeral march played at twice the speed. The vibrations seemed to rattle the brass key in Julian's pocket. He looked toward the third supper box, where the man with the emerald ring sat. The man was tapping his fingers on the table, not to the rhythm of the melody, but to a counter-rhythm that seemed to match the conductor's left hand. They are communicating across the garden, Julian realized aloud, his voice trembling. The estate, the deeds, they aren't just selling my land. They are using the funds to finance something here tonight. The masked figure nodded. Vauxhall is where the old world comes to rot and the new world is bought. You are the only honest thing in this garden, Mr. Thorne. which makes you the most dangerous variable in their equation. The crescendo of fear. Suddenly, the music reached a fever pitch. The drums began a rolling, thunderous beat that mimicked the sound of approaching cavalry. The crowd began to cheer, unaware that the music was masking the sound of a struggle in the nearby dark walks. Julian saw a flash of steel, a small stiletto blade tucked into the waistband of a passing servant. The conductor looked directly at Julian. For a split second, the skeletal man smiled, a jagged, knowing expression, and brought his baton down in a crashing finale. The sound was deafening, a wall of brass and percussion that seemed to freeze time itself. As the echoes died away, leaving only the ringing in his ears, Julian looked for the silver mask. It was gone, again, but in its place, tucked into the crevice of the tree bark where the figure had stood, was a small scrap of parchment. He unfolded it with trembling hands. It wasn't a note. It was a musical score, a single line of handwritten notes with a word scribbled underneath in crimson ink: "Run." The symphony was over, but the shadows were just beginning to move. Julian realized then that the music hadn't been playing for the crowd's delight. It had been playing for his execution. A taste of decadence. The warning on the parchment, the single crimson word "run," still burned in Julian's mind. Yet in the labyrinth of Vauxhall, one could not simply flee without drawing the very attention he sought to avoid. To escape, he had to blend in, and to blend in, he had to partake in the garden's most famous ritual, the supper. Julian steered his steps toward the brightly lit pavilions of the supper boxes. Here, the air was no longer thin and cool. It was heavy, saturated with the decadent aromas of roasted poultry, nutmeg, and the sharp, fermented tang of the garden's notorious punch. The hunger he had ignored all day suddenly flared, a hollow ache in his stomach that felt like a betrayal of his nerves. The altar of gluttony. He found a vacant box at the far edge of the grove, sheltered by a weeping willow whose branches were strung with tiny, flickering amber lamps. As he sat, a waiter appeared as if from a trapdoor, a pale man in a stained waistcoat who moved with the weary precision of a ghost. "The standard fare, sir," the waiter asked, not waiting for an answer. Within minutes, the table was transformed into a display of architectural gluttony. At the center sat the legendary Vauxhall ham. Julian stared at it. The slices were so impossibly thin, so translucent, they looked like shavings of pink marble or stained glass. It was said that a single ham could cover the entire 11 acres of the garden if sliced by a true Vauxhall master. Beside it lay a plate of chickens, roasted to a deep mahogany, and a bowl of syllabub, a frothy, lemon-scented cream that seemed to defy gravity. But the centerpiece was the bowl of arrack punch. It was a pale, deceptively clear liquid, swirling with slices of lemon and grated nutmeg. The scent was intoxicating, a mixture of sugarcane, tropical spices, and a hidden, fiery kick that promised to numb the senses. The poisoned chalice. Julian picked up a silver fork, his hand trembling slightly. He took a slice of the ham. It melted on his tongue like salty mist, leaving behind a flavor of smoke and honey. It was the taste of wealth, brief, expensive, and ultimately unsatisfying. He reached for the punch. As he lifted the glass, he remembered Mr. Sterling's warning: "If he offers you a drink, pour it into the gravel." But the man with the emerald ring was nowhere to be seen. He took a cautious sip. The liquid was cool, then suddenly hot, a wave of warmth spreading from his throat to his chest. The music from the orchestra stand, now playing a lively jig, seemed to grow clearer, the colors of the lamps more vivid. "It is spiked with more than just spirits, I suspect," a voice whispered from the shadows of the willow tree. Julian nearly dropped his glass. He didn't turn around this time. He knew the weight of that presence. "You have a habit of appearing when my glass is full," Julian said, his voice slightly thickened by the punch. "And you have a habit of eating while the hounds are at your heels," the silver-masked figure replied, stepping into the periphery of the lamplight. "That punch contains Batavia arrack, yes, but also a tincture of poppy to make the guests more agreeable to suggestion. Do not drink more than a mouthful, or you will find yourself signing away your soul before the moon sets." The bitter aftertaste. Julian pushed the bowl away. The the decadence suddenly turning to ash in his mouth. He looked at the half-eaten chicken and the translucent ham, realizing they were just distractions, gilded lures to keep the prey occupied while the trap was set. "Why are they doing this?" Julian hissed, leaning across the table. "I am a simple surveyor from the colonies. My land is vast, but it is raw. It is not worth this much theater." "It is not about the land, Mr. Thorne," the figure said, reaching out a gloved hand to pick up a slice of the paper-thin ham, only to let it fall back onto the plate. "It is about the location. Your valley sits on the mouth of a river they intend to use for a new trade route. To them, you are not a man. You are a stubborn rock in a stream that must be moved. And in Vauxhall, rocks are moved with silk ribbons and poisoned punch." Julian looked around the bustling supper boxes. He saw a young lord laughing as he fed syllabub to a woman in a black mask. He saw a merchant counting gold coins under the table, and he saw the waiters moving like silent weavers through the tapestry of excess. He stood up, his head spinning slightly from the single sip of punch. The decadence of the meal now felt like a shroud. He realized that every bite he took was a debt, and every lamp he admired was a distraction. "I've had my fill of your garden's treats," Julian said, his voice regaining its colonial iron. "Now, show me the way out of this glutton's trap." The silver mask tilted. "The way out is through the dark walks, Mr. Thorne, but be warned, once you leave the light of the supper boxes, the rules of the garden change again. The decadence ends, and the hunt begins." Julian stepped out of the box, leaving the half-finished feast behind. He left the warmth of the lamps and the scent of nutmeg, walking toward the looming wall of darkness where the manicured gardens met the untamed shadows of the night. The path of lovers. The transition from the blinding amber brilliance of the grand walk to the entrance of the dark walks was like stepping from a fever into a cold, moonless night. Julian Thorne paused at the edge of the light. His boots hovered over the line where the manicured gravel met the untamed, moss-covered earth of the garden's periphery. Behind him, the orchestra's violins screamed in a frantic crescendo. Before him, there was only the low, rhythmic thrum of crickets and the muffled, scandalous whispers of those who wished to remain unseen. In the 18th century, the dark walks of Vauxhall were a place of legend and ruin. Here, the lanterns were spaced so far apart that they were mere pinpricks of light in a sea of velvet ink. It was a space where reputations were bartered for a kiss, and where the rigid class structures of London melted into the shadows of the elm trees. Into the labyrinth. Julian stepped forward, his hand tightening around the brass key in his pocket. The air here was damp. It smelled of wet fern, rotting leaves, and the sharp, salt-heavy breath of the nearby Thames. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw silhouettes moving in the darkness, pairs of figures huddled together in the alcoves of the hedges. He heard a sharp, feminine gasp followed by a low, masculine chuckle. To his left, a lace fan fluttered in the darkness like the wing of a trapped moth. Julian felt like an intruder in a sanctuary of secrets. He moved with a surveyor's caution, counting his paces, keeping his back to the thicker foliage. "Do not look too closely at the faces you pass, Mr. Thorne," a familiar, raspy voice drifted from a high laurel bush. Julian didn't flinch this time. He stopped and waited. The silver-masked figure stepped out from behind a weeping willow, the moonlight catching the metallic sheen of the skull mask. In the dark walks, anonymity is the only protection one has. To recognize someone here is to make an enemy for life. The risk of reputation. "I am not here for romance or ruin," Julian said, his voice a low hiss that was swallowed by the dense trees. "I am here because you told me this was the way out." "The way out, or the way in," the figure replied, their cloak rustling like a serpent over the grass. "Look there, through the gap in the yew trees." Julian followed the gesture. In a small, dimly lit clearing stood a man in a red frock coat, his wig slightly askew. He was talking earnestly to a woman whose face was hidden by a heavy silk hood. They weren't lovers, their posture was too stiff, their gestures too urgent. "That is a member of Parliament," the figure whispered, leaning closer to Julian, "and the woman is a courier for the French. In the Grand Walk, they would be arrested for treason." Here, in the path of lovers, they are merely two people sharing a midnight stroll. The shadows of Vauxhall provide a legal darkness that no courtroom can penetrate. Julian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He realized that the decadence of the food and music was merely a distraction for the commoners. The true business of the empire was conducted here, in the mud and the silence. The ambush of shadows. Suddenly, the rhythmic sound of the crickets stopped. The silence became absolute, heavy as a shroud. "We are not alone," Julian whispered, his colonial instincts, honed by years of navigating the Virginia frontier, suddenly screaming a warning. From the darkness ahead, three figures emerged. They weren't the silken aristocrats of the rotunda. They were Mohawks, the wealthy, bored thugs of the London night, wearing rough leather jerkins over their fine shirts, their faces smeared with charcoal. One of them held a short, heavy bludgeon, another toyed with a folding knife that gleamed like a predatory tooth. "Well, well," the leader sneered, his voice thick with the scent of cheap gin. "A colonial bird has flown into the wrong nest. I hear you have something in your pocket, Mr. Thorne, something made of brass that doesn't belong to you." The silver-masked figure stepped back into the deepest shadow, vanishing with a speed that felt supernatural. Julian was alone. "My property is my own," Julian said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low register. He didn't have a sword, but he had a surveyor's heavy brass transit level in his satchel, a solid weight of metal that could crack a skull as easily as it could measure an acre. The duel in the dark. The first Mohawk lunged. Julian didn't retreat. He stepped into the attack, using his shoulder to throw the man off balance. The gravel crunched violently under their feet. The second man swung the bludgeon, but Julian ducked, the wood whistling inches above his head. In the chaos of the dark walks, no one came to help. A couple 10 yards away simply turned and walked in the opposite direction, protecting their own reputations at the cost of a man's life. This was the law of the garden. What happens in the dark stays in the dark. Julian swung his satchel with a grunt of exertion. The heavy brass struck the leader's arm with a sickening thud. The man howled, dropping his knife. Julian didn't wait for a second chance. He turned and sprinted, not back toward the lights of the Grand Walk, but deeper into the labyrinth, toward the sound of the falling water he had heard earlier. His heart thundered in his ears, drowned out only by the distant, mocking laughter of the orchestra. He had survived the path of lovers, but he had lost his guide. As he broke through a thicket of thorns, he found himself standing before a mechanical waterfall, the Cascades, where the water glowed with a strange, artificial blue light. The hunt was no longer a metaphor. It was a cold, breathing reality. The alchemist's fire. The mechanical roar of the Cascades behind him was suddenly eclipsed by a sound that shook the very foundation of the garden. A low, guttural hiss, like 1,000 serpents taking flight, erupted from the far end of the meadow. Julian Thorne looked up, his face splattered with the cold spray of the artificial waterfall, just as the sky above Vauxhall shattered into a million burning diamonds. This was the alchemist's fire, the legendary fireworks display that the Londoners whispered about for months. It was not merely a show, it was a weapon of distraction. The sky turned a violent, bruised crimson, followed by a shower of emerald sparks that illuminated the upturned, masked faces of the crowd below. The thunder of light. Julian stood in the clearing, caught between the darkness of the woods and the blinding brilliance above. Every time a rocket exploded, the world became a strobe light of terrifying clarity. One moment, he saw the three Mohawks searching for him near the hedges. The next, the darkness swallowed them again. "Do not move, Mr. Thorne. Even shadows have eyes when the sky is on fire." The voice came from directly behind him. Julian didn't turn. He recognized the cold, metallic scent of the silver mask. But this time, there was someone else. A second silhouette stood beside the masked figure, a man in a heavy traveling cloak, his face hidden by the brim of a wide tricorn hat. "Is he the one?" the stranger asked. His voice was thick with a northern accent, harsh and impatient. "He is the surveyor," the silver mask replied. "The one with the brass key and the honest eyes, a dangerous combination in a city built on lies." A conversation in the clouds. A massive explosion of gold and white light, the grand finale of the first set, erupted overhead. The noise was deafening, a physical weight that pressed against Julian's chest. Under the cover of this thunder, the secret conversation began. "Your valley in Virginia, Mr. Thorne," the stranger said, stepping closer until Julian could see the glint of a steel pistol tucked into his belt. "It is not just about a trade route. There are minerals in that soil, black stones that burn longer and hotter than any wood. The alchemist's fire you see in the sky, it is fueled by the very things hidden beneath your family's feet." Julian felt a surge of cold fury. "So, you kill men for stones, you build a pleasure garden to hide a corporate theft." "We build empires, Mr. Thorne," the stranger hissed, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the falling sparks. "And empires require fuel. Your deeds are the only thing standing between the crown and a fortune that could power the Navy for a century. Give us the key, and you walk out of this garden. Keep it, and you become just another ghost in the dark walks." The alchemy of choice. Julian looked up at the sky. A rocket shaped like a dragon was spiraling upward, its tail a trail of screaming blue fire. He realized then that the silver-masked figure wasn't leading him to safety. They were the broker, the middleman in a transaction for his life. "And if I refuse?" Julian asked, his hand tightening around the heavy brass instrument in his satchel. The silver mask tilted. "Look around you, Julian. The music is playing, the people are cheering, the sky is burning. If a man were to fall here, his scream would be nothing more than another cheer in the crowd. That is the beauty of Vauxhall, it masks the screams with symphonies." Suddenly, a massive, multicolored explosion, the great sun, burst directly overhead. For 5 seconds, the garden was as bright as high noon. Julian saw the stranger's hand move toward his pistol. He didn't think, he acted. Using the surveyor's heavy brass transit level like a mace, Julian swung with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. The metal connected with the stranger's wrist with a sickening crack. The pistol fell into the damp grass. "The fire is beautiful," Julian shouted over the roar of the final rockets, "but it burns out. My land is eternal." The escape in the smoke. As the final, massive volley of fireworks, 100 rockets at once, turned the sky into a blinding white void, a thick, sulphurous smoke began to settle over the garden. It was a smog of burnt saltpeter and charcoal, blinding and choking. Julian didn't wait to see if the stranger would recover. He dove into the smoke, his lungs burning. He ran blindly, away from the cascades, away from the silver mask, and away from the man with the emerald ring. The alchemist's fire had done its job. It had masked the conversation, it had masked the violence, and now it provided the perfect, suffocating shroud for Julian Thorne to vanish into the deeper, more dangerous heart of the garden. Behind him, the crowd roared in approval, oblivious to the blood on the grass and the secret that had just set the night on fire. Stolen glances. The smoke from the alchemist's fire still clung to the upper branches of the elms, but Julian Thorne had already retreated from the violence of the clearing. He found himself back in the semi-civilized fringes of the Grand Walk. His lungs were burning, and his green velvet coat was dusted with gray ash. He needed to disappear, not into the shadows this time, but into the light. He needed to become just another face in the crowd of 1,000 aristocrats. He slowed his pace, smoothing his waistcoat and wiping the sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. As he stepped near a gilded pavilion decorated with silk ribbons, he stopped. The air here was different. It didn't smell of sulfur or river mud. It smelled of expensive damask roses and aged sherry. And then he saw her. The lady in lavender. She was standing near a marble statue of Apollo, partially shielded from the main throng by a flowering hawthorn bush. She wore a gown of pale lavender silk that seemed to glow with a life of its own under the amber lamps. Her hair, unlike the towering, powdered monstrosities of the other women, was pulled back in a soft, elegant style, adorned only with a single pearl. But it was her mask that held Julian captive. It was not a full skull like the mysterious guide, but a delicate half-mask of silver lace that covered only her eyes. Julian's breath caught. In the wilderness of Virginia, beauty was rugged and honest. This was artifice turned into a masterpiece. As if sensing his gaze, she turned. Her eyes, a sharp, intelligent emerald green, locked onto his from across the gravel path. The silent duel. Neither moved. The space between them, perhaps 20 paces, felt like a vast, unbridgeable canyon. Julian knew he should look away. He was a hunted man, a colonial commoner with blood on his hands from the struggle near the Cascades. To stare at a member of the British aristocracy was a social sin. To stare at her felt like a dangerous gamble. Yet she did not look away. Her gaze was not one of disdain or casual curiosity. It was a look of recognition, as if she were reading the secrets written in the lines of his face. She tilted her head slightly, her fan, a delicate thing of ivory and silk, stopping mid-flutter. Julian felt a surge of defiance. He didn't bow, nor did he look at the ground. He stood his ground, his colonial pride rising to meet her aristocratic poise. In that moment, the hierarchy of the British Empire seemed to crumble. They were just two souls caught in a garden of illusions, communicating in a language of stolen glances. The language of the fan. "You have the look of a man who has seen a ghost, sir," she said, her voice surprisingly clear, cutting through the distant hum of the orchestra. She didn't move toward him, but her voice pulled him forward like a silken thread. Julian took a slow step, then another, until he stood just outside the shadow of a hawthorn bush. "Perhaps I have," Julian replied, his voice rough. "Or perhaps I am merely tired of the masks this city wears." She closed her fan with a sharp, decisive click, a sound that, in the secret code of the 18th century fan, signaled a willingness to converse. "Vauxhall is not a city, Mr. Thorne. It is a mirror. If you do not like what you see, perhaps you are looking too deeply." Julian's heart skipped. "You know my name." "I know many things," she whispered, stepping closer. The scent of her rose perfume was overwhelming now, a sweet contrast to the sulfur still in his throat. "I know that you are the Virginian with the disputed deeds. I know that the men in the third supper box are terrified of you. And I know that you are currently standing in the light, while a killer is searching for you in the dark. A dangerous alliance." She reached out, her gloved fingers briefly brushing his velvet sleeve. It was a touch so light it could have been a falling leaf, but it sent a jolt of electricity through Julian's arm. "My name is Lady Elena," she said, her eyes searching his. "My father is one of the men who wants your valley, but I have a different appetite for interest." Julian narrowed his eyes. "Why tell me this? Is this another trap, another taste of your decadent punch?" Elena laughed, a soft, musical sound that held a hint of genuine sadness. "If I wanted to trap you, Julian, I would have called the guards 5 minutes ago. No, I am here because I find the civilization of my father's world to be a bore. I prefer the fire of the new world." She leaned in, her mask almost touching his cheek. "Go to the Hermit's Grotto. It is at the far end of the wilderness walk. There is a man there who is not what he seems. He has the answers the silver mask refused to give you." The parting glance. Before Julian could respond, a group of laughing courtiers rounded the corner, their torches flickering. Elena immediately stepped back, her fan fluttering open in an instant, her face resuming a mask of bored, aristocratic indifference. "A charming garden, is it not, sir?" she said loudly. "For the benefit of the newcomers." Julian understood the game. He bowed deeply, a perfect, practiced bow that hid his shaking hands. "Indeed, madam, most illuminating." As he turned to leave, he felt her eyes on his back. He looked over his shoulder one last time. Lady Elena was watching him, her silver lace mask glinting in the amber light. It was a stolen glance that promised both salvation and ruin. Julian Thorne walked away, heading toward the Hermit's Grotto, his mind a whirlwind of green eyes and silver lace. He had come to Vauxhall to save his land. He was beginning to realize he might have to save his heart as well. The Hermit's Grotto. The air grew progressively colder as Julian Thorne moved away from the neon-like brilliance of the central pavilions. He was now navigating the wilderness, a section of Vauxhall designed to mimic the rugged unpredictability of nature, though every vine was pruned and every rock was placed by a gardener's hand. His heart, still erratic from his encounter with Lady Alina, began to steady as the heavy scent of damp moss and cold stone filled his senses. Ahead, tucked into a hillside of artificial limestone and tangled ivy, lay the hermit's grotto. It was a fake cave intended to provide the wealthy with a momentary thrill of isolation. But tonight, it felt like the only honest place in this garden of lies. The entrance to the underworld. Julian paused at the mouth of the grotto. The entrance was framed by jagged rocks and lit by a single, dying blue lantern that cast long, distorted shadows against the cavern walls. Inside, the sound of the orchestra was reduced to a ghostly vibration, felt more in the teeth than in the ears. He stepped inside. The floor was uneven, covered in a thin layer of sand and crushed seashells that crunched under his boots with a sound like breaking teeth. The walls were encrusted with fossils and minerals that glittered weakly in the blue light. It was meant to be a place of solitude, a sanctuary for the weary soul, but as Julian moved deeper into the cool, damp interior, he realized he was not alone. The living statue. In a small alcove at the back of the cave sat the hermit. In many 18th century gardens, wealthy owners actually hired men to live in these grottos, forbidden to cut their hair or speak to guests, serving as living ornaments of melancholy. The man sat on a stone bench, draped in a burlap robe that looked as old as the earth itself. His beard was a white tangle of salt and silver, his eyes were closed. Julian stopped 3 paces away, his hand resting on the brass key in his pocket. "Lady Alina sent me," Julian whispered. The name felt like a prayer in the silence of the cave. The hermit didn't move for a long moment. Then his eyes snapped open. They were not the eyes of a madman or a decorative hermit. They were the eyes of a soldier, sharp, calculating, and full of a terrible grief. "Alina is a fool for hope," the old man said, his voice a deep resonance that seemed to vibrate from the stone walls. "And you, Virginian, you are a fool for coming here." The shocking discovery. The hermit stood up with a fluid grace that belied his ragged appearance. He reached into the folds of his burlap robe and pulled out a small, leather-bound cylinder. "They told you that your family's land was wanted for coal, didn't they? They told you it was about trade routes and steam." The hermit let out a short, bitter laugh. "The British Empire does not spend this much gold for stones. They spend it for blood." He walked toward a small table carved into the rock and unrolled a piece of parchment. It was a map, but not a map Julian recognized. It was a map of the Virginia frontier, but overlaid with strange, geometric symbols and troop movements. Julian leaned in, his breath hitching. "This is a military dispatch, dated next month." "The dispute over your deeds was never about the land itself," the hermit hissed, pointing a gnarled finger at a specific bend in the river near Julian's home. "It was a diversion. Your valley is the hidden staging ground for a secret invasion, a strike against the French that would ignite a war your colonies are not prepared for. Your family was murdered not by greedy merchants, but by the Crown's own shadow office to clear the path for their cannons." Julian felt the world tilt. The brass key in his pocket felt like a brand. His family, his father, they hadn't been victims of a random border raid. They were casualties of a global chess game played by men in silk coats 3,000 miles away. The price of truth. Suddenly, a faint scraping sound came from the entrance of the grotto. The hermit's expression shifted instantly from grief to cold iron. "They are here," the old man whispered, extinguishing the blue lantern with a swift motion of his hand. In the sudden, absolute darkness, Julian could hear the rhythmic clink of a sword against a scabbard. The men from the third supper box, the man with the emerald ring, had found him. The grotto, his moment of solitude, had become a tomb. "The key, Julian," the hermit whispered in his ear, his breath smelling of bitter herbs. "The key doesn't open a chest. It opens the mechanism in the cascades. If you want to stop the war, you must drown the garden." Julian Thorne, the surveyor from the wilderness, finally understood. He wasn't just fighting for his land anymore, he was fighting for the future of a continent. He gripped his heavy brass tool, his knuckles white in the dark, as the first shadow stepped into the cave. The shocking discovery was complete. The pleasure garden was the birthplace of a war, and Julian Thorne was the only one left to burn it down. Gilded cages. The escape from the hermit's grotto had been a frantic, silent scramble through the limestone crevices, but as Julian Thorne emerged back into the torchlit periphery of the gardens, he found himself face to face with a different kind of imprisonment. He was no longer running from assassins. He was trapped within the invisible bars of a society that valued the shine of a button more than the soul of a man. He had ducked into a secluded, circular pavilion known as the Temple of Camus. Here, the walls were made of delicate, gilded latticework, allowing the breeze to pass through while keeping the vulgar world at bay. Inside, sitting on a velvet settee, was Mr. Sterling, the man in the lavender silk suit, quietly sipping a glass of clear, expensive gin. The illusion of choice. "You look weary, Mr. Thorne," Sterling said, his voice smooth as polished marble. "Sit. In this cage, at least, the predators wear silk and use words instead of knives." Julian sat heavily, the brass key in his pocket feeling like a lead weight. "The hermit told me the truth, Sterling. This entire garden, it is a lie, a gilded cage for the mind while the body prepares for war." Sterling laughed, a soft, cynical sound. "Everything in London is a gilded cage, my boy. The king is a prisoner to his ministers, the ministers are prisoners to their debts, and these fine ladies are prisoners to their corsets and reputations. You Americans speak of freedom as if it is a bird you can catch in the woods. But here, we know the truth. Freedom is merely the ability to choose which cage you prefer to live in." Freedom versus structure. Julian looked out through the gilded lattice at the passing crowd. In Virginia, if a man is hungry, he hunts. If he wants a home, he builds it. There is a rigid structure here that feels like a slow death. Every bow, every mask, every thin slice of ham, it is all designed to remind you that you are not your own master. "Precisely," Sterling replied, leaning forward, his eyes sharp. "Structure is the only thing keeping the world from dissolving into chaos. You call it a cage, we call it civilization. You want the freedom of the wilderness, but the wilderness has no music, no art, no philosophy. To have this," he gestured to the glowing garden, "you must sacrifice the self. You must accept the cage." "And if the cage is built on blood," Julian hissed. "The hermit showed me the maps. My family died so your structure could expand. That isn't civilization, it's a slaughterhouse with better lighting." The weight of the key. Sterling went silent. He looked at Julian's bruised knuckles and the dust on his green velvet coat. "Then you have a choice, Virginian. You have the key. You can use it to unlock the truth and destroy the cage, or you can trade it for a life of comfort within these walls. My masters would give you a title, a mansion in Mayfair, and a seat in the very structure you despise." Julian stood up, his colonial iron returning to his spine. "You don't understand. A gilded cage is still a cage. I would rather be a dead man in the woods of Virginia than a well-fed dog in your London gardens." Sterling sighed, a genuine note of regret in his voice. "Then I fear your night in Vauxhall is about to become very short, Mr. Thorne. Once you reject the cage, the keepers have no choice but to put you down." Julian walked to the entrance of the pavilion. He looked back at Sterling, who was already pouring another glass of gin, a man perfectly content in his golden imprisonment. Julian realized then that the most dangerous thing in Vauxhall wasn't the assassins, it was the temptation to stop fighting and simply enjoy the music. He stepped out of the Temple of Camus, leaving the gilded lattice behind. He was a free man in a garden of slaves, and he had a mechanism to find and a war to stop. The Cascades of Illusion. Leaving the gilded cage of the pavilion behind, Julian Thorne navigated toward the northern edge of the garden, where the sound of the orchestra was slowly replaced by a rhythmic, metallic thrumming. This was the location of the famous Vauxhall Cascades, a feat of 18th century engineering that promised the beauty of a mountain waterfall within the heart of a London marsh. But as Julian approached, he realized that this natural wonder was the ultimate metaphor for the garden itself, a magnificent lie powered by hidden gears and exploited labor. The air grew damp and heavy with the smell of stagnant water and machine grease. Ahead, a massive wooden structure, painted to resemble rugged granite, rose 30 feet into the air. The machine behind the magic. Julian stood at the base of the cascades. Every few minutes, a bell would ring, and a torrent of water would pour over the artificial ledges, illuminated by hidden lanterns of deep sapphire and emerald green. The crowd gasped in delight, applauding the sublime power of nature. But Julian, the surveyor, looked past the shimmering curtain of water. He saw the thick, iron pipes snaking into the mud. He heard the rhythmic groan of the massive water wheels being turned by unseen horses and men in the pits below. It was beauty, yes, but it was a cold, calculated beauty that required constant, invisible toil to sustain its illusion. "Everything you see is a puppet show, Mr. Thorne," a voice drifted from the mist. It was Lady Elena. She stood on a small wooden bridge spanning the artificial stream, her lavender silk gown dampened by the spray. She looked not at the waterfall, but at the dark, oily machinery visible through a gap in the painted boards. The metaphor of artificial beauty. "Look at how they cheer," Elena said, gesturing to the aristocrats. "They want the roar of the ocean without the danger of the tide. They want the wildness of your Virginia, but only if it is contained within a frame and lit by oil lamps. We are people who have fallen in love with the reflection, Julian, and we have forgotten the sun." Julian walked onto the bridge, standing beside her. "The hermit said the key I carry belongs here. He said if I want to stop the war, I must drown the garden. But how can a brass key stop a machine this massive?" Elena turned to him, her silver lace mask wet with mist, making it look like she was weeping diamonds. "The cascades are not just for show. The water wheels power more than the fountains. They drive the hidden presses in the cellars, the ones printing the forged maps and the false declarations of war. If the gears are jammed, if the water is diverted to the lower chambers, the truth they are manufacturing will be washed away before it can reach the king's hand." The choice of the surveyor. Julian looked at the brass key. It was not a key to a door, but a tool for a mechanism, a precision-engineered wedge designed to be inserted into the main regulator of the water wheel. To do so, he would have to climb into the heart of the machine, beneath the crushing weight of the artificial falls. "Why help me, Elena?" Julian asked. "If I destroy this, your father's world, the world that gives you this silk and these pearls, will begin to crack." Elena reached out, her hand cold and wet as it touched his cheek. "A cage of silk is still a cage, Julian. I would rather see the garden drown than watch it birth another century of blood. Go. The gears are loudest when the music is softest. Use the rhythm of the falls to hide your movements." The descent into the gears. As the bell rang for the final grand cascade of the hour, Julian disappeared behind the painted granite boards. He entered a world of dark, dripping wood and screeching iron. The roar of the water above was deafening, a physical weight that threatened to pull the structure down. He saw the main axle, a massive trunk of oak bound in iron, spinning with terrifying force. Beside it sat the regulator, a small brass slot that looked exactly like the teeth of his key. This was the illusion unmasked. Here in the dark, Julian Thorne was no longer a guest or a victim, he was the saboteur. He waited for the exact moment when the water reached its peak volume, hiding the sound of his work. With a grunt of effort, he jammed the brass key into the regulator. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a shriek of metal on metal tore through the night. The massive wheels shuddered, the rhythm of the falls faltered, and for the first time in 50 years, the mechanical heart of Vauxhall missed a beat. Julian scrambled back into the mist just as the blue lights flickered and died. The cascades of illusion had stopped. In the sudden, ringing silence, the screams of the crowd were not of delight, but of confusion. The mask of the garden had begun to slip. The unmasking hour. The grand clock atop the rotunda did not chime. It groaned, a heavy metallic sound that signaled the arrival of midnight. In the 18th century, midnight at Vauxhall was the unmasking hour, the moment when the fantasy was supposed to end and the reality of London was to resume. But for Julian Thorne, as he stepped away from the prince's pavilion with the stolen deeds pressed against his ribs, the unmasking was not a social ritual, it was a violent revelation. The atmosphere in the garden had shifted. The warm, amber glow of the lanterns seemed to have turned a sickly, jaundiced yellow. The laughter of the crowd, once musical, now sounded like the baying of hounds. The shedding of personas. Julian moved through the grand walk, but he no longer walked like a guest. He moved like a shadow. All around him, the ritual was beginning. Men and women stood in small circles, reaching up with gloved hands to untie the silk ribbons of their masks. To his left, a countess removed her lace mask to reveal the tired, scarred face of a common debt collector. To his right, a gallant hero unmasked to reveal a man Julian recognized from the legal offices of Cheapside, the very man who had denied his family's inheritance 3 weeks ago. The pleasure garden was shedding its skin, and the beast underneath was cold, calculating, and hungry. "The masks are off, Mr. Thorne," a voice whispered from behind a statue of Neptune. "Do you dare to show yours?" Julian didn't have to turn. He knew the silver-masked figure was still there, but as the figure stepped into the light of a dying torch, they too reached for their ribbons. The silver silk fell away, revealing a face that Julian had never expected. It was not a stranger. It was the young clerk from the Virginia Land Office, the one who had supposedly been killed in the raid that took Julian's father. The face of betrayal. "Caleb," Julian's voice was a ragged whisper. You were alive this whole time. You were working for them." Caleb, his face pale and eyes full of a haunting guilt, nodded slowly. "Survival is a powerful mask, Julian. They didn't kill me because I knew how to forge the surveyor's marks. They brought me here, dressed me in silk, and made me their ghost. I told myself I was protecting you by getting you through the garden tonight. But in truth, I was just leading you to the table where they could finish the job." The shock hit Julian harder than any physical blow. The guide, who had been whispering warnings, was the very hand that had signed his father's death warrant. The convergence of villains. Suddenly, the circle of unmasking guests parted. Standing there, now without his mask, was the man with the emerald ring, Sir Thomas Gaunt. His face was heavy-jowled and pockmarked, his eyes devoid of any human warmth. Beside him stood a dozen men in dark greatcoats, their hands resting on the hilts of their hangers. "The play is over, Mr. Thorne," Sir Thomas said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence of the walk. "The midnight hour is here. You've played the hero, you've sabotaged the cascades, and you've even won a game of cards. But look around you. There are no witnesses left. Everyone you see is on my payroll. The aristocracy you saw tonight, they are the ghosts of the East India Company. The lovers in the dark, they are the king's privateers." Julian reached into his satchel, his fingers brushing the cold brass of the transit level. He looked at Caleb, then at Sir Thomas, then at the ring of steel closing in around him. The final stand of the new world. "You think because you took off your masks, you've shown me the truth?" Julian shouted, his voice ringing with a colonial fire that silenced the distant violins. "The truth isn't your faces. The truth is that you are terrified. You are terrified of a man who cannot be bought. You are terrified of a world where your titles mean nothing and a man's word is his own." Julian looked up at the sky. The moon was a pale sliver, partially obscured by the smoke of the fireworks. He realized that the unmasking hour was his only chance. In the confusion of the guests leaving and the staff extinguishing the lamps, he had one final move to make. "Caleb," Julian said, his eyes locking onto his old friend, "if there is any part of the Virginia soil left in your soul, run, because I am about to drown this garden for real." With a sudden, violent movement, Julian didn't attack Sir Thomas. He turned and threw his heavy brass instrument directly into the largest glass chandelier hanging from the Grand Walk's trellis. The glass shattered like 1,000 screams, and the burning oil spilled downward, igniting the dry silk ribbons and the wooden frames of the pavilions. As the fire flared, turning the unmasking hour into a chaos of flame and shadow, Julian Thorne dove into the crowd. The masks were off, the secrets were out, and the pleasure garden was finally, truly burning. The unmasking hour. The great clock atop the rotunda did not chime. It groaned, a heavy, metallic sound that signaled the arrival of midnight. In the 18th century, midnight at Vauxhall was the unmasking hour, the moment when the fantasy was supposed to end. And the rigid reality of London was to resume. But for Julian Thorne, as he stepped away from the prince's pavilion with the stolen deeds pressed against his ribs, the unmasking was not a social ritual. It was a violent, soul-shattering revelation. The atmosphere in the garden had shifted. The warm, amber glow of the lanterns seemed to have turned a sickly, jaundiced yellow. The laughter of the crowd, once musical, now sounded like the baying of hounds across a foggy marsh. The shedding of personas. Julian moved through the grand walk, but he no longer walked like a guest. He moved like a predator in a forest of silk. All around him, the ritual was beginning. Men and women stood in small circles, reaching up with gloved hands to untie the silk ribbons of their masks. To his left, a countess removed her lace mask to reveal the tired, scarred face of a common debt collector. To his right, a gallant hero, unmasked to reveal a man Julian recognized from the legal offices of Cheapside, the very man who had denied his family's inheritance 3 weeks ago. The pleasure garden was shedding its skin, and the beast underneath was cold, calculating, and hungry. "The masks are off, Mr. Thorne," a voice whispered from behind a statue of Neptune. "Do you dare to show yours?" Julian didn't have to turn. He knew the silver-masked figure was still there, but as the figure stepped into the flickering light of a dying torch, they too reached for their ribbons. The silver silk fell away, revealing a face that Julian had never expected. It was not a stranger. It was the young clerk from the Virginia Land Office, the one who had supposedly been killed in the raid that took Julian's father. The face of betrayal. "Caleb," Julian's voice was a ragged whisper. You were alive this whole time. You were working for them." Caleb, his face pale and eyes full of a haunting guilt, nodded slowly. "Survival is a powerful mask, Julian. They didn't kill me because I knew how to forge the surveyor's marks. They brought me here, dressed me in silk, and made me their ghost. I told myself I was protecting you by getting you through the garden tonight. But in truth, I was just leading you to the table where they could finish the job." The shock hit Julian harder than any physical blow. The guide, who had been whispering warnings, was the very hand that had signed his father's death warrant. The entire night, the encounters, the warnings, the hints, had been a choreographed play to see if Julian could be manipulated into submission. The convergence of villains. Suddenly, the circle of unmasking guests parted. Standing there, now without his mask, was the man with the emerald ring, Sir Thomas Gaunt. His face was heavy-jowled and pockmarked. His eyes were devoid of any human warmth. Beside him stood a dozen men in dark greatcoats, their hands resting on the hilts of their hangers. "The play is over, Mr. Thorne," Sir Thomas said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence of the walk. "The midnight hour is here. You've played the hero, you've sabotaged the cascades, and you've even won a game of cards, but look around you. There are no witnesses left. Everyone you see is on my payroll. The aristocracy you saw tonight, they are the ghosts of the East India Company. The lovers in the dark, they are the king's privateers." Julian reached into his satchel, his fingers brushing the cold, heavy brass of the transit level. He looked at Caleb, then at Sir Thomas, then at the ring of steel closing in around him. The final stand of the new world. "You think because you took off your masks, you've shown me the truth?" Julian shouted, his voice ringing with a colonial fire that silenced the distant violins. "The truth isn't your faces. The truth is that you are terrified. You are terrified of a man who cannot be bought. You are terrified of a world where your titles mean nothing and a man's word is his own." Julian looked up at the sky. The moon was a pale sliver, partially obscured by the smoke of the fireworks. He realized that the unmasking hour was his only chance. In the confusion of the guests leaving and the staff extinguishing the lamps, he had one final move to make. "Caleb," Julian said, his eyes locking onto his old friend, "if there is any part of the Virginia soil left in your soul, run, because I am about to drown this garden for real." With a sudden, violent movement, Julian didn't attack Sir Thomas. Instead, he turned and threw his heavy brass instrument directly into the largest glass chandelier hanging from the Grand Walk's trellis. The glass shattered like 1,000 screams. The burning oil spilled downward, igniting the dry silk ribbons and the wooden frames of the pavilions. As the fire flared, turning the unmasking hour into a chaos of flame and shadow, Julian Thorne dove into the crowd. The The masks were off, the secrets were out, and the pleasure garden was finally, truly burning. The scandalous waltz. The fire in the Grand Walk had created a pocket of pure, chaotic static, but as Julian Thorne fled the burning trellis, he found himself pushed by the panicked crowd into the most unlikely of sanctuaries, the Great Music Gallery. Here, the air was not yet filled with smoke, but with something far more dangerous, the first, scandalous notes of a waltz. In 1750, the waltz was not a dance, it was a revolution. To hold a partner's waist in public was considered an act of social suicide. Yet, as the world outside began to burn, the orchestra, perhaps out of madness or a final act of defiance, began to play a sweeping, triple-meter melody that pulsed like a collective heartbeat. The intersection of fate. Julian, his green velvet coat torn and his face smeared with soot, stumbled onto the polished parquet floor. He looked like a wolf in a room full of peacocks. The aristocrats, momentarily ignoring the distant screams, stood paralyzed by the music. It was then that Lady Elena appeared, gliding through the crowd like a phantom of lavender silk. She did not look at his ruined clothes or his bruised knuckles. She looked only at his eyes that held the wild, untamed fire of the new world. "They are closing the gates, Julian," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the swelling violins. "The men in the greatcoats are searching every carriage. You cannot walk out of here." "Then I'll fight my way out," Julian replied, his hand moving toward the empty space where his satchel used to be. "No," Elena said, her eyes flashing with a desperate brilliance. "To survive, you must become invisible, and in this room, the only way to be invisible is to be the center of attention. Dance with me." The defiance of etiquette. Before he could protest, she took his hand. It was a scandal that rippled through the room faster than the fire outside. A colonial commoner, a man of mud and blood, placing his hand upon the waist of the daughter of a peer of the realm. They began to move. At first, Julian was clumsy. His boots, accustomed to the uneven soil of Virginia, struggled with the slick grace of the parquet. But then, the rhythm took him. The waltz was not a minuet of distance. It was a dance of proximity. As they spun, the room blurred into a kaleidoscope of gold leaf, flickering candles, and shocked faces. "You are shaking," Elena murmured, her breath warm against his neck. "I am a surveyor, Elena," Julian gritted out, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the room. "I map forests. I don't spin in circles while my enemies wait at the door." "Look at them, Julian," she commanded. He looked. Sir Thomas Gaunt and his men had reached the doors of the gallery. They were scanning the shadows, looking for a man hiding, a man running, a man cowering. They were not looking for the man who was currently holding the most beautiful woman in London in a scandalous embrace at the very center of the floor. The eyes of the Ton. The Ton, the elite of British society, watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. Whispers erupted like sparks. "Who is he? The audacity! Look at his hands." But as the music reached its crescendo, the dance became something more than a disguise. It became a bridge between two dying worlds. In Julian's arms, Elena was no longer a gilded cage's bird. She was a woman claiming her own agency. In Elena's lead, Julian was no longer a hunted animal. He was a man asserting his right to exist in the heart of the empire that sought to crush him. They spun faster and faster. The centripetal force seemed to pull the secrets out of the air. Julian felt the deeds in his coat pocket pressing against her silk bodice. For a moment, the war, the land, and the fire didn't exist. There was only the sweep of the violin, the scent of roses, and the dizzying realization that they were dancing on the edge of a precipice. The final turn. The music stopped with a sudden, dramatic flourish of the cellos. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Julian and Elena stood in the center of the floor, their chests heaving, their eyes locked. Sir Thomas Gaunt stepped forward from the doorway, his emerald ring glinting in the candlelight. His face was a mask of pure, murderous intent. He had realized the trick. "Beautifully executed, Lady Elena," Gaunt said, his voice dripping with venom. "A performance for the ages, but even the longest dance must end with a bow." He signaled to his men, but the Ton, still caught in the spell of the scandalous waltz, did not move aside. The very scandal that should have ruined Julian had created a momentary shield of curiosity. The aristocrats pressed forward, wanting to see the face of the man who had dared to touch the untouchable. In that half-second of social confusion, Elena leaned in and pressed a small, cold object into Julian's palm. It was a key, not of brass, but of iron. "The servants' passage," she whispered, "under the orchestra dais. Go, Julian, go back to your wilderness and tell them that London is not as cold as it looks." Julian didn't bow, he didn't look back. He vanished into the crowd of gossiping lords and ladies, leaving the scandalous waltz as a legend that would be whispered in the salons of London for 100 years. He had defied their etiquette. Now he had to survive their wrath. Escape from the grove. The iron key Elena had pressed into Julian's palm felt like a sliver of ice against his feverish skin. The music of the scandalous waltz was still ringing in his ears, but it was quickly being drowned out by the heavy, rhythmic thud of jackboots on the parquet floor. Julian did not look back. He dove beneath the velvet draperies of the orchestra dais, crawling through the dust and discarded violin strings, until his fingers found the cold, rusted hinges of the servants' hatch. He slipped through. The transition was instantaneous, from the perfume and gold leaf of the gallery to the narrow, damp darkness of the undertunnels. The labyrinth of hedges. Julian emerged at the far edge of the grove, where the manicured beauty of Vauxhall surrendered to the towering, jagged silhouettes of the labyrinthine hedges. These were not the decorative bushes of the Grand Walk. These were ancient, 12-foot walls of yew and hawthorn designed to disorient and trap. Behind him, the night was torn apart by the sound of whistles. "Spread out," a voice bellowed, "Sir Thomas Gaunt. He is heading for the northern perimeter. 5 guineas to the man who brings me his head, 10 for the one who brings me the deeds." Julian sprinted into the first opening of the maze. The gravel hissed beneath his boots. The air here was stagnant, smelling of wet earth and the sharp, bitter scent of crushed boxwood. He turned left, then an immediate right, his surveyor's mind desperately trying to map the geometry of the dark. The breath of the hunter. He stopped, pressing his back against the prickly wall of a hedge. His breath came in ragged, burning gasps. In the silence, he heard it, the slow, deliberate crunch of gravel only 20 paces away. "I know you can hear me, Virginian," a voice whispered. It was not Gaunt, it was one of the Mohawks, the man with the charcoal-smeared face. "You think these hedges will hide you? I've hunted foxes in Surrey more clever than you. This isn't a garden anymore, it's a slaughter box." Julian didn't answer. He reached down and found a heavy stone. He threw it hard toward the opposite end of the corridor. Crack! The hunter lunged toward the sound. Julian moved in the opposite direction, his movements fluid and low. He was no longer a guest. He was back in the forests of the frontier, where silence was the difference between life and a shallow grave. The mirror of despair. The labyrinth opened into a small, circular clearing. At its center stood a collection of distorted mirrors, another of the garden's curiosities. Julian saw himself reflected a dozen times, a man in a ruined green coat, covered in soot, looking more like a ghost than a gentleman. Suddenly, a lantern's light swept across the mirrors, blinding him with 1,000 jagged reflections. There! A pistol shot rang out, the lead ball shattering a mirror inches from Julian's head. The sound was deafening in the confined space of the clearing. Julian dove through a gap in the hedges, the thorns tearing at his velvet sleeves, drawing blood from his forearms. He was running blind now. The maze felt as though it was shifting, the walls closing in as the fire from the Grand Walk began to cast a hellish, flickering orange glow over the top of the greenery. The final boundary. He saw it, the boundary wall, a massive, soot-stained structure of brick and mortar that separated the pleasure garden from the lawless marshes of the South Bank. But between him and the wall stood Sir Thomas Gaunt, his emerald ring glinting as he leveled a silver-plated dueling pistol at Julian's chest. "The cards are finished, Mr. Thorne," Gaunt said, his voice terrifyingly calm amidst the chaos. "Give me the deeds, now." Julian stood his ground, the iron key clutched in his fist like a weapon. "You can have the deeds, Sir Thomas, but you'll have to pull them from the mud of the Thames." As Gaunt's finger tightened on the trigger, the ground beneath them suddenly buckled. The sabotage of the cascades had finally taken its toll. The diverted water had eroded the foundations of the northern labyrinth. A torrent of cold, muddy water erupted from the earth, a miniature deluge that sent Gaunt stumbling backward. Julian didn't wait. He used the distraction to leap for the lowest branch of an overhanging elm. He hauled himself up with the last of his strength, looking down one last time at the sinking, watery ruin of the labyrinth. He scrambled over the top of the wall and fell, tumbling down into the cold, honest mud of the riverbank. The pleasure garden was behind him. The frantic chase was over, but the cold reality of the night was only just beginning. The price of pleasure. Julian Thorne lay face down in the freezing, sulphurous mud of the south bank. The transition was absolute. Only minutes ago, he was surrounded by the scent of lavender and the glow of 10,000 lamps. Now, the only light was the jagged, hellish orange reflection of the burning garden in the black mirror of the Thames. He coughed, his lungs burning from the smoke of the alchemist's fire, and pushed himself up onto his knees. The weight of the deeds in his pocket felt heavier than the mud on his coat. He was safe from the labyrinth, but as he looked back at the towering walls of Vauxhall, the glamour had finally vanished. He no longer saw a paradise, he saw a gilded tomb. The anatomy of a lie. As the adrenaline began to recede, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion, Julian began to realize the true price of pleasure. He watched from the darkness of the riverbank as the elite of London fled the smoke. They stumbled out of the gates, their wigs askew, their silk gowns stained, their masks lost in the panic. Without the lamps and the music, they were merely terrified hollow shells. Julian realized that the grandeur he had admired was built on a foundation of absolute cruelty. The music that had charmed him was paid for by the blood of people like his father. The translucent ham that the guests ate so casually was sliced by men who lived in the damp cellars, never seeing the sun. It is a heavy realization, is it not, Mr. Thorne? Julian didn't jump. He knew that voice, raspy, dry, and ancient. He turned to see Mr. Sterling sitting on a piece of driftwood, his lavender silk suit now ruined by soot, but his expression as calm as a graveyard. The ledger of blood. "You saw the beauty," Sterling said, staring at the burning Grand Walk. "But you didn't see the price. Every candle that burns in that garden requires a man to die in a coal mine. Every silk ribbon requires a child's fingers to bleed in a factory. Vauxhall is not a garden, Julian. It is an accounting book where the pleasure of the few is balanced by the agony of the many." Julian wiped the mud from his face, his eyes hard. "And you sit there and watch it burn as if it's just another show." "I'm a man of my time, Julian," Sterling replied with a sad, thin smile. "I accepted the price long ago, but you are different. You came here with the dust of the New World on your boots, and you refused to pay. You broke their machine, you won their game, and you stole their future. That is a debt they will never forgive." The shadow of the Empire. Julian looked at his hands, calloused, bloodied, and stained with the grease of the Cascades. He realized that his struggle for his family's land was only a tiny spark in a much larger fire. The Pleasure Garden was the heart of the British Empire, a place designed to make people forget that their comfort was a byproduct of conquest. He thought of Lady Elena, still trapped inside that burning structure, perhaps even now facing the wrath of her father. He thought of Caleb, the friend who became a ghost. The price of Julian's survival was the destruction of the illusions he had once held dear. "The deeds in your pocket," Sterling whispered, pointing a gloved finger. "They are not just paper, they are the seeds of a new world. But to plant them, you must leave this old world behind entirely. You must become the thing they fear most, a man who knows the truth behind the glamour." The cold awakening. The sound of the fire grew more distant as the London rain began to fall, a cold, grey drizzle that hissed against the burning pavilions. Julian stood up, his boots sinking into the river muck. He felt a profound sense of grief, not for the garden, but for the innocence he had lost within its walls. He looked at the Thames. Somewhere in the fog, a wherry was waiting to take him back to the city, and from there to a ship that would carry him home. He had entered Vauxhall as a surveyor seeking justice. He was leaving as a revolutionary seeking a future. "The price of pleasure is silence," Julian said, his voice echoing across the dark water, "and I will be silent no longer." He turned his back on the glowing ruins of the South Bank and began to walk through the mud toward the mist. Behind him, the last of the Vauxhall lamps flickered and died, leaving the garden and the empire it represented to face the cold, unforgiving dawn. Dawn over the pavilion. The transition was not a sudden burst of light, but a slow, agonizing bleed of grey across the horizon. As Julian Thorne sat shivering on the stone steps of the Lambeth Wharf, the dreamlike delirium of the night began to dissolve into the cold, unforgiving reality of a London morning. The magical lanterns of Vauxhall, once looking like clusters of glowing jewels, were now nothing more than charred glass globes and soot-stained skeletons hanging from blackened trees. The fire had died down to a smouldering, bitter smoke that clung to the surface of the river. The Thames itself, stripped of its midnight reflections, revealed its true face, a murky industrial sewer carrying the debris of 1,000 broken promises. The ghost of the pavilion. Julian looked back toward the South Bank. The grand pavilion, which had once seemed like a palace of infinite possibility, now looked like a stage set after the play has failed. The gold leaf was peeling in the damp morning air. The silk drapes were shredded and soaked with rain. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the deeds. In the harsh blue light of dawn, the parchment didn't look like a sacred map to a new empire. It looked like old, yellowed skin. The ink was faded, and the wax seal of the crown looked like a dried scab. This was the reality he had fought for, not a legend, but a piece of property that men were willing to murder for. The sun has a way of stripping the soul bare, does it not, Mr. Thorne? Julian turned his head slowly. Standing at the edge of the wharf was a woman. She was not the Lady Elena of the scandalous waltz. She wore no mask, her face was pale, and there were dark circles of exhaustion under her emerald eyes. Her lavender gown was torn at the hem, caked with the grey mud of the riverbank. The unveiling of truth. "Elena," Julian's voice was a dry croak. "The night is over, Julian," she said, walking toward him with a limp. "My father is being questioned by the King's Guard, not for the war he tried to start, but for the gold he failed to protect. In this city, losing money is a far greater sin than losing a life." She sat on the cold stone beside him, her presence no longer smelling of roses, but of wood smoke and rain. They sat in silence for a long time, watching a coal barge groan past them in the mist. "Was any of it real?" Julian asked, staring at the ruin of the garden, "the music, the cascades, the way you looked at me in the rotunda." Elena looked at her hands, her fingers trembling. "The beauty was a lie, Julian, but the fear was real. The desire to escape was real. We were two ghosts dancing in a burning house, pretending for a moment that we were alive. But the sun always rises, and the house is always ash." The cold ledger of morning. Across the river, the city of London began to wake up. The bells of St. Paul's rang out, not with the melody of a symphony, but with the cold, rhythmic tolling of a workday. The street sweepers were out, the gin shops were opening their doors to the broken, and the lawyers were sharpening their quills. Julian realized then that the pleasure garden was just a momentary fever. The real war was not fought with fireworks and masks, but with the slow, grinding machinery of the morning. "I have a boat waiting at the customs house," Julian said, standing up. His limbs felt like lead, his green velvet coat now a heavy, wet burden. "I am going back to Virginia, not to a valley of coal, but to a home that I have to rebuild from the ground up." Elena stood as well. She didn't ask to go with him. She knew, as he did, that she was a creature of this old world, bound by the very chains she had helped him break. The departure of the dreamer. "Take the key, Julian," she whispered, touching the iron key she had given him during the waltz. "Keep it as a reminder, not of the dance, but of the moment you realized that the cage was open." She leaned in and kissed his cheek, a cold, salt-tasting kiss that felt like the morning mist. Then she turned and walked back toward the city, her lavender dress disappearing into the grey fog of London. Julian Thorne stepped into a small wherry. As the boatman pushed off, Julian looked back at the south bank one last time. The dawn over the pavilion was complete. The lights were out, the masks were gone, and the American traveler was left with nothing but the truth and the long, cold journey home. The night at the pleasure garden was over, but the story of the man who survived it was only just beginning. The final farewell. The Thames was no longer a black ribbon of mystery. It had become a cold, grey reality reflecting the pale light of a London dawn. Julian Thorne stood at the very edge of the water's stairs, his boots half submerged in the retreating tide. Behind him, the smoke from the ruined Vauxhall Gardens rose in thin, skeletal fingers toward the sky. Ahead, anchored in the deeper, restless currents of the river, lay the Virginia Star, the merchant vessel that would carry him away from the ghosts of the old world. The air was sharp with the scent of salt, tar, and the lingering bitterness of burnt silk. It was a moment suspended between two lives. The last anchor. A small wherry waited at the bottom of the stairs, its boatman leaning impatiently on his oars. But Julian did not move. He was looking at the figure standing 10 paces away, draped in a heavy, charcoal-colored cloak that hid her ruined lavender finery. Lady Elena did not look like an aristocrat anymore. She looked like a survivor of a shipwreck. "The tide is turning, Julian," she said. Her voice was steady, but it carried the fragility of glass. "If you do not leave now, the king's men will find a reason to keep you here forever. The deeds you carry are a fire that London will try to extinguish." Julian stepped toward her, his hand moving to the pocket where the iron key and the brass key sat side by side, two metals, two worlds. "I cannot leave you here, Elena. My father's valley is wide and the air is clean. There are no masks there, no gilded cages. A promise at the water's edge." Elena looked at the river, a sad smile touching her lips. "I am a creature of the shade, Julian. I was born in the shadows of these palaces. I would wither in your sunlight. My task is here to ensure that my father's greed does not build another Vauxhall on the grave of more families." Julian took her hand. It was cold, but her grip was fierce. "Then I make you this promise," he said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate against the lapping waves. "I will go back. I will rebuild the house they burned. I will plant the fields they tried to steal. And every year, on the night of the midsummer moon, I will look toward the east." He paused, the sound of the ship's bell echoing across the water, a lonely, rhythmic tolling. "I will remember the woman who danced with a stranger while the world was on fire. I will remember that even in the heart of the machine, there was a soul that refused to be crushed." The exchange of totems. She reached into her cloak and produced a small silver locket. She didn't give it to him. Instead, she took the iron key from his hand and placed the locket in its stead. "The key belongs to the garden," she whispered. "The locket belongs to the journey. Inside is a lock of my hair and a grain of London soil. Carry it to Virginia, Julian. Let the old world nourish the new, but never let the new world become the old." Julian closed his fingers over the silver. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief, the realization that some loves are not meant for houses and hearths, but for memories and milestones. He leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. No words were needed. The promise was sealed in the shared breath of the morning air. "The last boat departs. Farewell, Julian Thorne," she whispered. "Farewell, Elena," he replied. Julian turned and stepped into the rocking wherry. The boatman pushed off immediately, the oars cutting through the grey water with a rhythmic, splashing thud. Julian sat in the stern, his eyes fixed on the receding shore. He saw Elena standing at the water's edge, her cloak billowing in the wind like the wings of a dark bird. She did not wave. She simply stood there, a solitary pillar of strength against the backdrop of a crumbling empire. As the wherry drew closer to the Virginia Star, the mist began to swallow the London skyline. The rotunda, the Grand Walk, and the ruins of the pavilions disappeared into a shroud of white. By the time Julian climbed the rope ladder and stood on the wooden deck of the ship, the shore was gone. He walked to the bow, looking west. The Atlantic was waiting. The wilderness was waiting. He felt the weight of the deeds against his chest, and the silver locket in his hand. The pleasure garden was now only a dream, but the promise made at the water's edge was the only reality he had left. The sails unfurled with a sound like a giant's intake of breath. The ship began to move, carving its way through the cold reality of the morning, carrying a surveyor back to his land and a hero back to his life. Echoes of the night. The Atlantic Ocean was a vast, cleansing desert of salt and storm, a churning blue void that lay between the nightmares of the old world and the promises of the new. For 6 weeks, Julian Thorne stood upon the deck of the Virginia Star, watching the sun sink behind the western horizon. To the crew, he was a silent, brooding passenger in a scorched velvet coat. But within his mind, the orchestra of Vauxhall still played, the violins of the rotunda still shrieked through the whistling of the wind, and the emerald eyes of Lady Elena still stared at him through the sea mist. The night at the pleasure garden was not a memory that faded. It was a scar that had redefined the very contour of his soul. The ghostly cargo. As the ship drew closer to the rugged coastline of the Virginia colony, Julian found that the objects he carried had begun to change. The deeds to his family's valley, once mere parchment, now felt like the heavy bones of a martyr. The silver locket Elena had given him felt warmer against his skin, a constant, rhythmic reminder of a heartbeat left behind. He realized that he was not returning as the same man who had left. The surveyor who sought only land had been replaced by a man who had seen the gears of the world. He understood now that pleasure was often the mask of power, and that peace was sometimes just a silence bought with blood. The echoes of that one night followed him across the ocean, whispering that his struggle was no longer just about boundaries and soil. It was about the fundamental right to exist without a master. The return to the soil. When the ship finally dropped anchor in the Chesapeake Bay, the air was different. It did not smell of coal smoke and jasmine. It smelled of ancient oak, damp earth, and the untamed, electric charge of a coming storm. Julian stepped off the boat onto the wooden pier of Yorktown. His boots, once caked in the mud of the Thames, now touched the honest dirt of his home. He traveled inland for days, moving past the settlements and into the deep, green heart of the frontier. When he finally reached his valley, the ruins of his father's cabin stood like a jagged, blackened tooth against the sunset. The trees were taller, the brush thicker, but the silence was absolute. There were no mechanical waterfalls here, no hidden musicians, no spies in the shadows. Julian knelt by the cold hearth of his childhood home. He dug a small hole in the center of the cabin floor and buried the iron key, the key to the garden he had drowned. He kept the silver locket and the deeds. The architecture of a new life. Years passed, and the echoes of Vauxhall began to serve a new purpose. Julian did not just rebuild the cabin, he built a manor of stone and cedar, a structure designed with the elegance he had seen in London, but without the cages. He used his knowledge of the Cascades to build irrigation systems that fed the valley's crops, turning the memory of an illusion into a reality of abundance. But the most profound echo was the way he governed his land. He became a man who refused to wear a mask. He spoke the truth in a colony that was beginning to grumble against the distant king. When the recruiters for the crown came to his door, asking for the burnable stones beneath his soil, Julian Thorne looked them in the eye and refused. He knew the price of their pleasure, and he was no longer willing to pay it. The Midsummer Promise. On the night of the midsummer moon, exactly 1 year after his escape, Julian stood on the high ridge overlooking his valley. The Virginia night was loud with the sound of cicadas, a wilder, more honest symphony than anything Handel could have composed. He pulled the silver locket from his waistcoat. As the moonlight hit the silver, he felt a strange, shimmering connection to the east. 3,000 miles away, Elena was likely navigating a different kind of darkness. He wondered if she could feel the wind he felt, if she could hear the echoes of the waltz they had shared while the world burned. "The night is over," Julian whispered to the wind, his voice steady and free, "but the fire still burns." He realized then that he had not just survived a night in a pleasure garden, he had been forged in it. The echoes of the night were no longer a haunting, they were a foundation. He closed the locket, tucked it near his heart, and walked back down toward his house, a man who had found his place in a world that was finally, truly his own. The last lantern of his memory flickered and died, replaced by the rising sun of a new continent. The masquerade was finished. The truth had won.